Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch with the League. Before we start, I'd like to make a few announcements. Please remain muted throughout the session, and there will be a question and answer session after we hear from our speakers today. So if you have any questions for them, please put them into the chat directed to Kathy Morgan. Finally, I would like to advise you that this session is being recorded, and the link to the recording of each of the sessions will be available on our League website within 48 hours. The link to the website is in the chat. At this time, I would like to introduce the president of our local league, Pat Butler, who will make a few remarks.
Thank you, Pat, and thanks to all of you for attending today. We're delighted to have you join us. I'm going to speak briefly about the League and then introduce our speakers. The goal of the League for the past 103 years has been to educate voters. We're a grassroots, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering everyone to fully participate in our democracy. The League does not support or oppose any political party or candidate. It encourages informed and active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. We invite all of you to join us. Yes, that includes the men. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Meisel and Ashley Myers. Dan serves as Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League, a leading anti-hate organization that counters anti-Semitism, extremism, and all forms of bigotry. Its 110-year-old mission is to stop the defamation of Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. Dan previously served as chair of ADL's regional board, also chaired local and national ADL committees. His ADL office serves Ventura, Santa Barbara, and San Luis Obispo counties. Dan is also a writer and producer of films, including the feature All She Can, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and aired on HBO. Dan was previously a First Amendment and general litigation attorney and has written opinion pieces, reviews, and articles in multiple publications. Ashley Myers is the Assistant Regional Director of ADL, serving San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. She holds a bachelor's degree in early childhood education from the University of Washington and 2 graduate degrees in Jewish nonprofit management and Jewish education from the Hebrew Union College. Her work at ADL is motivated by the belief that it is our duty to leave the world a better place than we found it. Dan, Ashley, the floor is yours.
Hello, Pat. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you and to Kathy Morgan for inviting us to discuss this topic, a really important topic. And we'll give Ashley an opportunity to introduce herself as well.
Yes, thank you so much, both for the work that the League does in our community and for inviting us to have the opportunity to speak with all of you today. Dan's going to start our presentation, so I'm going to go mute for now.
All right. Let me go ahead and share screen, which will take a moment to get set up. 1 second. There we go. All right. Ashley, you can give me a thumbs up if you're seeing that correctly. Okay. So the topic that we were asked to address today is about hate crime and hate incident reporting. And so it's a little bit of what we do, but I'd like to back up for those that are unfamiliar with the Anti-Defamation League and give you a little bit of background as to why we would be ones asked to address this topic. As Pat mentioned, the Anti-Defamation League's mission, which dated back to its founding in 1913, is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. So the understanding of the Anti-Defamation League from its founding was the only way to keep a minority or marginalized community safe is to keep all minority and marginalized communities safe. So what developed over the time was an organization that was a leading voice on identifying and responding to anti-Semitism, but also with a broad civil rights agenda to protect minority and marginalized communities from discrimination, bias, harassment, and hate groups and hate incidents. The ADL is now in about 25 regional offices around the country. We are fortunate to have 5 offices in California, and our office, while physically located in Santa Barbara, serves Ventura County, Santa Barbara County, and San Luis Obispo counties. And the way we go about our work falls down into generally 3 categories: is that we investigate incidents and trends as they occur. We advocate for policy solutions and other measures to respond to problematic trends and incidents. And then we educate in schools, students, professional development for educators, both about bias generally and about teaching about the Holocaust, particularly with respect to addressing anti-Semitism. But our general anti-bias education addresses hate and bigotry of all forms and supports the creation of inclusive school climates on school campuses and in workplaces. So part of the investigation work that we do involves receiving reports of hate and bias incidents from members of the community. And that's the process that we're really going to talk about today. So I want to start with just some language issues between the distinction between hate crimes and hate incidents. There's a tendency to think any incident involving hate is a hate crime, but this legal distinction is actually fairly important. So the hate crime really does refer to a criminal violation. There needs to be a criminal statute that was violated. And federal hate crimes have been around for a while. The first hate crime statutes were passed in 1968, when Congress made it a crime to use or threaten to use force to willfully interfere with any person because of race, color, religion, or national origin. And at that time, it was focused on incidents where somebody was in the practice of participating in a federally protected activity, such as public education, employment, jury service, travel, or the enjoyment of public accommodations. So that was followed up in 1968 by another statute that made it a crime to use or threaten to use force to interfere with housing rights because of the victim's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And the understanding then at the time was that the reason to single out hate crimes is because there is an additional impact. And so as recognized by Chief Justice William Rehnquist back in 1993, biased motivated crimes are more likely to provoke retaliatory crimes, to inflict distinct emotional harms on their victims, and to incite community unrest. And so that was the reasoning for enhancing penalties and recognizing the distinctive nature of a crime that is affiliated with some kind of biased motivation. Now, we didn't see those kind of statutes apply more generally outside of somebody engaged in some kind of federal activity until much later. And one of there were really 2 incidents that prompted the finalization of legislation of our Federal Hate Crimes Act. And one of them, you may recall, was the truly tragic killing of Matthew Shepard in October of 1998. He was a student at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and he was singled out, targeted, and killed as a result of his LGBTQ status. And the other crime that really drove things forward was on June 7th, 1998, the killing of James Byrd, who was targeted in a racially motivated incident. There had been efforts to get hate crime legislation passed, but these 2 incidents propelled it forward. And even though they occurred back in 1998, it took until 2009 to get a federal hate crimes law passed, known as the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act. ADL was a leader of the coalition of more than 200 organizations, including law enforcement, that advocated for the passage of the law. And the crime makes it a federal crime, that the statute makes it a federal crime to willfully cause bodily injury or attempt to do so using a dangerous weapon because of the victim's actual or perceived race, color, religion, or national origin. And so it extended beyond just incidents involving somebody engaged in federal government activity to more general categories of violent crimes. In California, many states, there are about 45 states around the country that have their own versions of state hate crime legislation. And in California, this exists in the California Penal Code, starting with section 422.55, that defines a hate crime. And so a hate crime is a criminal act committed in whole or in part because of one or more of the following actual or perceived characteristics of the victim. And so the legislation identifies these characteristics. And the interesting elements of this is that, first of all, there needs to be an underlying crime for it to qualify as a hate crime. But second of all, these characteristics need to be actual or perceived. So if somebody is, the victim of a hate crime, not because they are actually a member of a group, but because the perpetrator perceives them to be, even if mistakenly, then hate crime legislation can apply. It's also important to note that it's not just targeting somebody who is a member of a protected group, but if somebody displays some kind of perceived association with that group, it also can qualify as a hate crime. Now, so I want to come back to kind of, the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident is that both of them involve all the same factors. The one difference is that in order to have a hate crime, there has to be an underlying criminal act that can be vandalism, it can be a battery or an assault. In a hate-motivated incident, there's no underlying criminal act. So the bigotry being expressed may be bigotry that is protected by the First Amendment. It may be, hate speech is often protected speech. There are some exceptions to it. But it's important to make that distinction between what is hate crime and what is hate incident, more for understanding of outcomes and remedies, but recognizing that both can have a similarly terrible impact and both should come with some consequences. In one case, criminal consequences, and in another case, civil or relational or social consequences are possibilities. So examples of bias-motivated incidents, as I said, could be, these are incidents that are motivated by hatred, prejudice, or bigotry, but they could be hate speech, hate rallies, display of offensive materials on one's property. Distribution of hate flyers is a bit of an interesting one because people often ask, well, isn't distribution of hate flyers on, neighborhoods, which we've seen quite a bit of in the last few years, isn't that littering? And the answer really kind of depends on jurisdictions as to whether they want to prosecute it as littering. But the challenge is that if that jurisdiction allows distribution of flyers for, say, political candidates or other purposes, then it may violate the First Amendment simply to prosecute people based on the content of the flyers that they are leaving in somebody's home. But we're seeing some jurisdictions go ahead and prosecute for littering in those circumstances. We're also seeing some jurisdictions adopt some time, place, and manner restrictions on the distribution of flyers, so that if somebody is distributing a flyer in the middle of the night, or despite there being a sign that says no solicitors on that property, that may not be littering, but could constitute a violation of another ordinance that is not, it is content neutral. It's based around on the time, place, and manner of the distribution itself. So just to provide, some clarity on these distinctions, here are a couple of examples. On the upper right, if we have a vandalism of in this case, a bike path with language, "Kill the Jews," you have vandalism, there's physical vandalism, which is a violation of probably a misdemeanor in this case. You also have an identification of a perceived victim, so a clear motivation on the part of the perpetrator. So this, I would say, would likely qualify as a hate incident that also rises to the level of a hate crime. And the way that usually works is that you have an underlying crime, and in California, there's it's not a simple legislative scheme about how hate crime legislation is applied. but it's usually as an enhancement to an underlying crime. But in that upper right, I think you have kind of a clear example. In the lower right, you might recognize the small group that displayed some banners over the Borchard overpass. There were some racist banners. I prefer not to use a picture that includes the banners so as not to amplify their messaging. But there was some discussion as to whether that is just a hate incident or a hate crime. And while there's some legislation and ordinances in some places about affixing signs above a freeway, in this case, if they're just holding a sign, then arguably it may not rise to the level of violation of ordinance and may constitute protected speech. In the left side, we have some graffiti that was found on school grounds. And so you see a swastika, which is a hate symbol, but then you see the words drunk punk that may have referred to song lyrics or a band. There were several images like this around the school. And so the first question is there an identified, a targeted group and indication of a motivated bias? And I have to say that without more information, that element of a targeted group or bias is missing, even though there's use of a hate symbol. So because this wasn't on the side of a synagogue or a black church or a location that is identified with a particular protected group, it's just as possible that the perpetrator here was simply calling the school district, using Nazi symbolism to refer to somebody that was not part of a protected class. So it's unclear in that circumstance whether there really is the indicia of a hate crime. So that's how things can get a little murky. But now that you're hopefully a little bit clearer on the difference between hate crimes and hate or bias incidents, let's talk a little about why it's important to report and track both of them. So to do so, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to share what the outcomes of reporting can look like.
Thanks, Dan. So we use the data that is reported in a myriad of ways, both in our work at ADL and in society. And I'm going to start by talking about the 2022 California hate crime statistics. And this data comes from the FBI and local police departments who report it to the FBI. And before I share the data, I just want to share that, we know that this data, while the numbers are striking and important, it unfortunately is not all encompassing because local precincts can opt in to report this information to the FBI, but they are not required to do so. But what we think is really important about this data is that it tells a story about what's happening in our society and in our world. And in looking at this data, we see who are the most vulnerable populations within our communities. So the story that this data from 2022 is telling us is that 61% of racially motivated hate crimes targeted the African American community, which was an increase from 2021. And then we see that the next most vulnerable or most targeted group is the LGBTQ community, which received close to 20% of hate crimes in the state of California, also up from the previous year. And then we see that the next most targeted group within our society is religious motivated hate crimes. And within that group, breaking it down further, over 60%, so over half of those were hate crimes motivated by anti-Semitism. And within all three of those groups, unfortunately, it was an increase from 2021 to 2022. And I also just wanted to note that of the hate crimes that were reported, of those 2,120, 24 of them happened within Ventura County. So at ADL, Dan spoke a little bit about a hate incident versus hate data or a hate crime. At ADL, we look at incident data. This includes hate crimes, but is not limited to those legal stipulations that Dan was speaking about. And our main focus is anti-Semitism, but we take hate incidents from all forms of bias. And when we look at this data, just another reason that, data reporting and hate reporting is so important, we can see that 4 out of the last 5 years have been the highest years on record for while ADL has been tracking anti-Semitic incidents across the United States. And this work is really important because collecting this data informs our work and helps shape ADL's work and has the power to help shape policy within the United States. On Biden's first day in office, he issued an executive order on advancing equity and racial justice, and that has real implications because then each department within our federal government had to start engaging in DEI work. And more recently, the executive order for the U.S. national strategy to counter anti-Semitism was passed, and ADL had a big role in getting that executive order signed. And this data is really important because it helps us to advocate for educational programming in schools and workplaces. So I mentioned earlier that these numbers are not all-encompassing, and that one reason that they're not all-encompassing is because law enforcement does not have to share it with the FBI. They only can opt in. But just a few other reasons that people may not report hate crimes might be fear of law enforcement, fear of retaliation from those who inflicted the hate crime or incident on them. They don't know how to access a reporting system. They might not be able to use the technology, or just being embarrassed that they were the victim of a hate crime. So as severe as these numbers are, it's perhaps even more sobering to think about what the numbers might look like if every hate crime or hate incident was reported. So I spoke a little bit about why it's so important that we get this. And I'm going to share with all of you in a moment how to report to ADL. There are other systems and other platforms that track and take reports that Dan will speak about. But, at ADL, we really believe in the importance of reporting for the outcome it can have on community. When we have these stories, we know it's one path forward to making a change in our society. So how do you report an incident? Just like when you call the doctor's office and they say, if this is a life-threatening emergency, please hang up and call 911. If you're in a life-threatening emergency, ADL is not the place to report to in that moment. But, at a later, so God forbid you're in that situation, please call 911. But if it's something you witness and you feel comfortable, perhaps you're stumbling across graffiti, if you feel safe, take a picture, and then you'll go to our website, and I'll walk through that form in a second, and there's a place to attach those pictures, and you'll share the details with us, and then someone from a local ADL office will be in touch with you. I mentioned that we primarily focus on anti-Semitism, but we help with all forms of hate incidents. We often refer to different organizations, or we try to provide resources when we're not the right group to handle something. But I will speak through in a moment, how to go onto our website and how to report things to us, and someone from that local office will follow up with you. So if there's an incident that happens in Ventura County, it's Dan, myself, or someone from our office. But as was mentioned on the map that Dan shared in the opening of the presentation, we do this all across the country. So when you go to our website, right at the top, you can either go to adl.org, report an incident, or right at the top of our website, it says click here to report an incident, and it takes you to an online form that you will fill out. I do want to mention it's really important that we have this form. Sometimes we get phone calls or word of mouth, and this form is really what enables us to act when we hear about things. But you'll see this drop down menu of what happened. There's a space below where you can type in a further description. So for example, I spoke about graffiti earlier, so I'll just keep going with that example. You would say, I want to report, if it's something you stumbled upon, I want to report a hate crime or incident. And then the next box, you would say, I found graffiti, at this location. And then how can we help, might include, please contact the city, or you might already be aware of this. We know you track it, so we just wanted you to know. And then an upload a file is where, if you had taken a picture of, to keep going with the graffiti example, if you had taken a picture of that, that's where you would upload it. Then when you submit all of that, it'll take you to the next page. And this is really a little bit, I think, where you see that our online tracking, we really focus on anti-Semitism, but it's not entirely limited to that. So for this, to keep going with this example, depending on if you saw it at a school, maybe it was on the street, you would go in, and then there's a place, you would go in and say where you found it, and then there's a place to put in the city, and I believe it is the zip code, which is covered up. And then on the last page, you can put in your contact information. And if you want to be anonymous, I believe you can just write in anonymous, and it will still go through. So as far as technology will be, it's fairly straightforward. I just wanted to also mention a few other hate-related things that we have on our website, in addition to how to report an incident. One of our most valuable resources, I find, is our hate symbols database. If you felt like going down an internet rabbit hole, this is certainly a place where you could spend a lot of time reading about, different things, but it's an extremely valuable resource that we have on our website, filled with rich information. So I just wanted to share that. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that at the top of our website, you will see this bar of resources. That's where you'll find the hate symbols database. Another thing that we have is the glossary of extremism and hate. So I'm sitting right now in Santa Barbara, in our county to the north. We've had a lot of extremist activity from a group called the Black Shirts, and we have a whole page on them in that glossary. So just like if you encounter a symbol and you want to know more about what that means, if there's a group that you come across, there's a good chance that they are in that glossary as well. So I just wanted to share that we have such rich information on our website, more than I could possibly get into within the confines of this presentation. And now I'm going to turn it back to Dan.
Thank you, Ashley. So we talked about, Ashley just walked you through what ADL's report form looks like. There are some other more general organizations that have reporting mechanisms that we want to alert you to. And so one of the first models for reporting in a county-wide situation was LA versus hate. And so LA County launched this initiative that, through the 211 reporting system, allows anybody to call LA County to report a hate incident or hate crime. And the county will, the 211 service will respond to them within a short period of time and learn more about what the report is, and then refer out to a network of agencies, of which ADL is one, to provide support, advice, and counseling in response to what you have experienced. And some agencies also can provide referrals to legal services or to law enforcement as appropriate. So the model that LA County built really led to the development of a statewide initiative called California versus Hate. California versus Hate, instead of calling the 211 number, you would instead call this 866, actually it's 833, 8 no hate number. And then you're reporting to a state system that is then, where available, referring out to local agencies, depending on where in the state you have reported this incident. And both LA County and California versus Hate, which is a really new initiative, the county versus California versus Hate is just within the last 5 months or so, are tracking the data and reporting that they've received. And so in addition to referring to supportive network of services, they are collecting this data to be able to report statewide data, not just on hate crimes, as California is doing based on reports from law enforcement, but also now about hate incidents. In Ventura County, There also does already exist a 211 reporting system, and they advertise all of these different purposes for calling, but they also exist to receive hate bias and hate crime incidents. I think you're probably going to be seeing more promotion of that purpose relatively soon. But it's important to know that this does exist, and Ventura County, this is kind of a service within the, it's a program within Interfaith Children and Family Services, and they do provide annual reports about the calls that they receive, and they do have trained individuals that take calls and can provide referrals within the county. So this is, a growing program that we hope to help promote in the near future. And then there are other reporting systems that have popped up for particular groups. So in the wake of the pandemic, there was a huge uptick in hate incidents targeting the Asian community, the AAPI community. So we saw several reporting systems pop up from that community. And ADL actually advised one of those systems based on the incident reporting structure that we had created. One is at standagainsthatred.org. And the other place to report anti-Asian, anti-AAPI hate is called stopaapihate.org. Both of those, I think, are accessible from California. So one thing that we wanted to cover, before concluding and opening this up to questions is, in addition to reporting, what is an appropriate response to a hate or bias incident? We've talked about kind of the value of reporting. And the first thing that I wanted to mention is that, we could do a whole training on just what is upstanding, how to intervene or how not to intervene when you witness an incident occur. So we don't really have time to do a lot of that today. But I just wanted to mention, of course, the first priority is that you as a witness to this incident are safe, and that you only take measures that ensure your safety. You can always report, afterwards, if there's an opportunity to intervene. If it's a very minor incident, sometimes you can intervene just by diverting the conversation. If it happens with somebody that then maybe you are able to confront them. But the most important thing is that you keep yourself safe, and you can always report. There can always be follow-up later in most cases, not always, but in most cases. Then what is the general response to we like to see? Well, at ADL, we like to see in response to hate and bias incidences a combination of communal condemnation and meaningful engagement. And so the communal condemnation that you want is that's the response that checks the behavior. And so it can range really from a small group expressing displeasure about what just happened to a broad diversity of community organizations and community leaders expressing condemnation of what has occurred. And so this photo was from a vigil that occurred in Ventura area following the shooting in Buffalo, New York, the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. To have a nice cross-section of the community come out and express their support for victims and their condemnation of violent conduct is an important reaction to hate crime or incidents. In terms of meaningful engagement, well, that also can depend on the facts of the particular incident. But meaningful engagement is the opportunity to engage perpetrators or the larger community about these incidents occurring and how we as a community can prevent them from occurring in the future. So that could mean responsive educational programming if the incident has occurred on a campus, which is our photo to the left, or it could mean a large community activity. That photo is from a walk against hate that we sponsored with some other local organizations back in February of this year. That included both kind of a walk, there was a symbolic walk, but also a diversity festival that involved tabling organizations, educating community members about the missions of those organizations and the communities that they are designed to protect and serve. So really this form of communal condemnation and meaningful engagement can take many different forms depending on the nature of the incident. I'll just take a moment to mention that one of the real aggravating factors that we've experienced, over the last 15 years with respect to hate and bias incidents is when these incidents occur in online social media platforms. And it's a newer phenomenon, but this concept of communal condemnation and meaningful engagement that is so important is very challenged by the structure of social media platforms, because the way they are structured often does exactly the opposite. Is that instead of communal condemnation, when people are in online circles that have invited them into like-minded thinker groups, that they don't receive communal condemnation, they receive affirmation from those they're communicating with. And instead of meaningful engagement, you get amplification of the hateful or biased content and some isolation of those that are sharing it. So these are particularly challenging spaces to address hate and bias incidents. And that's why ADL and other organizations supported legislation last year called AB 587 that was passed, that would require online social media platforms to report on the kinds of user guidelines that they have in place, what hate, bias, and misinformation incidents they're seeing on their platforms, and what they are doing to counter it. And this is only kind of the largest social media platforms that are covered by this legislation. But it's the first step in starting to regulate those organizations that are not government entities, that are hosts of a tremendous flow of information, that are experiencing and providing a platform for hate and misinformation that they can do more to mitigate. So again, that's trying to figure out ways to accomplish the communal condemnation and meaningful engagement in those online spaces. We need a lot more of that to counter the kind of hate crime and excuse me, the hate bias incidents that people are experiencing. They can report to us. They can also report directly to the social media platform in hopes of getting it taken down. And if it hasn't been taken down, reporting to us can sometimes elevate it. We can bring it to the attention in a louder way at times. So just other abilities. It's not just things that happen in person, things that happen online. There can also be reporting of and tracking. We produce reports every year about the trends in online bias incidents. So that's plenty of landscape. And we want to make sure that we answer questions and concerns that you all may have about hate incident reporting and response. So we'll stop there and open this up for some questions, and hopefully are able to address the thoughts that you all have.
Oh, thank you, Dan and Ashley. That was very informative. I think you gave us a lot of good information and things to think about. And if anyone has any questions, please address them to me in the chat. But I did want to start by saying one of the things I wanted to mention was, how can we stop this culture of hate in the first place? How is it that we live in a society where we have this going on? And I know you mentioned working in the schools and doing presentations in the schools, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that. But also, on another note, I'm wondering if you've noticed any decline or decrease in being able to give these presentations, with some of the school boards wanting to, how do I want to put this, affecting what's being taught in the schools. So if you could talk a little bit about your outreach to the schools and other methods of just, trying to nip this culture of hate in the bud, I would find that very interesting. And then I do have a few more questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those questions, Kathy. Those are, in many ways, the $6 million questions, or, with inflation, far more than six. So hate and bigotry, we're not born with it. We learn it. And so it's really about finding, where that learning is happening, that unfortunate learning, and trying to counter it, and doing so in a preventative way to the best we can, rather than just responsively. So I will say that, yes, we live in a highly politicized landscape right now. And so one of the reasons that we're seeing, I think, an increase in hate crimes targeting these different groups is we have circumstances of increasing political division. We have division on some core values that are really creating a gap in our experiences and where we're gathering the information we're gathering. And when you add a pandemic on top of that, it's resulted in a lot of isolation, not a lot of experience of other that contributes to our understanding of others and the empathy that we have for others. So we have some challenging landscape developments that we're countering. But I think, the good news is that coming out of the pandemic, in particular, as students returned to school campuses, we heard right away administration, at districts in Ventura County, particularly calling us and saying, we're experiencing behavior that we haven't experienced before. Yes, we've seen some of this behavior, but not to the extent we're seeing it now. And I attribute that to the isolation that students were experiencing, frustrations that maybe that they were experiencing, that their parents were experiencing, and surviving or living so much in these online circles where they were encountering some of the issues that I just mentioned. And so it has given us a nice opportunity to respond, not just for, with programming to address this particular behavior, but to ask schools to do some needs assessment survey work to see, okay, what else is happening? If there, just because you have one incident doesn't mean that the proper response is to address that particular incident. And often you don't want to. You don't want to come in with programming based on a particular incident, because then some, the larger population may feel that this programming is punishment for the acts of a few. And so you don't want them feeling that. Instead, you want to assess whether that incident is indicative of a larger pattern of issues happening at that school. And when you come in responsively, first, we help the school communicate to the school community about what they have experienced on campus, which is very important. And then we want the school to be able to articulate a vision of the inclusive campus that they'd like to have. And then the programming that we bring in is not a one-off assembly. It's an opportunity for the school-wide to express the kind of inclusive campus they want, and then to engage in activities that are designed to foster that kind of a campus climate. So we've seen, our programming, frankly, in Ventura County schools have boomed since the pandemic. So we've had ongoing programming in, throughout the Moore Park district, now in the Conejo Valley Unified District. We have No Place for Hate schools in the Pleasant Valley district, and Ventura Unified is also engaging in programming. So I'm actually very pleased, not under the best circumstances, that with the proactivity and responsiveness that we've seen in school districts. And we did programming last year throughout the Moore Park district, and I'm not aware of a single complaint about that programming. So yes, there are political concerns about bias and to what extent this programming can include bias, but when parents actually get a sense of what this programming involves and the mutual respect focus of it, we have rarely encountered complaints of concerns from parents or faculty members. So I encourage those that don't know about it to find opportunities to experience it, and then hopefully advocate for it where they believe it's needed in their midst.
I'm glad to hear that you've had some good success and some good response to your programming. I think that's great, and I hope that it continues and that kids you're right. It's a learned behavior. Hate is a learned behavior. So if they can get some help, we can get some help and maybe change the society. That would be great. You mentioned last year's Walk Against Hate, which the League did table at. Are you having an event next year too?
So we have a date, actually a tentative date of April 21st, which is a Sunday. And what's unclear is whether we're going to do kind of the same kind of event structure that we did last year, or whether we're going to focus more on that diversity festival element that we did with the tabling organizations. So we are kind of reforming the community group of community leaders that came together to help plan the event that we hosted last year, to discuss kind of what the right structure or formation of the event is this year. So I would say save the date and stay tuned. It's yet to be determined exactly what the event will look like, but the response that we got from larger community was fantastic in terms of the need and value of that event, as both an expression of condemnation, but more importantly, an expression of a positive vision, a bipartisan positive division, a positive expression of community values.
Right. Well, we'll look forward to hearing more about that event coming up in April. You mentioned in your presentation, Ashley, that there were many reasons why people don't report. possibly shame and embarrassment and other things. A question was brought up. There has been reporting that hate crimes against Muslims and Arabs are severely underreported. Is that do you have any information as to whether that is correct? And are the same reasons that they would be unreported or underreported applicable, do you think? Or do you know of anything else that's being considered?
Wow, that's a great question. I don't have specific information about that, but my best guess, and I welcome Dan to weigh in here as well, is that the same reasons would apply that other groups would not want to report would apply to that group as well.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that we've had a long history of having this reporting system that the Jewish community has been particularly aware of. But I don't know if a similar system for reporting exists in the California, a Muslim community. And so these mechanisms like California versus hate and LA versus hate, and hopefully, Ventura County versus hate, that's why these are so important to us. We've seen the positive effect that getting this information has on responding to this form of hate, that we really want to advocate for these reporting systems so that the same data can be put to use to track trends targeting other communities. And the Muslim community is, really kind of right there. After the Jewish community, the Muslim community is the religious community most targeted with hate and bias. They certainly were after 9/11. And we've seen some upticks recently in response to what's happening in the Middle East. We've seen some terrible incidents that appear to be targeting people because of their affiliation, either with pro-Palestinian causes or
pairs that Dan has frozen, their connection.
Similar structures exist to support reporting of incidents targeting these other minority and marginalized. Now we're back. We froze a little bit, but
yeah, I wasn't sure if it was you or me, to tell the truth. You mentioned that after the COVID, after the pandemic started and the API community was having increased incidents of hate, they formed their own reporting mechanisms, and I wonder if the Muslim and Arab communities will do the same, moving forward. I do have a question in the chat from a gentleman. Is a panel discussion more effective than a single speaker in modeling civil discussion? Yeah, I'm just reading the question as it was asked, so perhaps you have some ideas on what he means. If not, I can ask him to unmute and ask his question himself.
Well, I can take a shot at it. It's a great question. So, the structure of it depends on the topic. And it really depends on what you're wanting to accomplish with that particular presentation. I've seen, and it depends on the panelists. Just as an example, given current events, I just saw a panel presentation that was hosted by Dartmouth University about the events in the Middle East at the moment. So thinking of an example of some of those contentious, events in our society at the moment. And the panel members were a member of the Middle Eastern Studies Department at Dartmouth and a member of the Jewish Studies Department at Dartmouth, who have been working together for several years. And their ability to discuss the issues that are so contentious today from a civil discourse perspective is just a wonderful modeling example of it. And so if you have people coming to the conversation with the right civil discourse approach, then I think it's wonderful to have a diversity of perspectives. I'll tell you, I personally don't like to be on a panel of more than 3, because in an hour-long event, you just don't get enough time really to often express an opinion. So it's important to have maybe a series of events where you explore different perspectives. But I think we have a tendency today to say that there are 2 sides to every issue, that we no longer trust kind of a one factual universe. And so we're very quick to say, oh, if one side exists, there might be another side, to the point where we're even seeing it in the South. We heard somebody say, well, if we're going to teach about the Holocaust, we need to teach about the other side. And my thinking is, no, there's no other side to the Holocaust. There might be interpretations of, perspective on it, but there isn't necessarily an other side to all issues. So having people present a particular perspective, and if others think there's another perspective, doing so at another event, I think may also be appropriate under the circumstances. But you don't always have to provide or assume that there's equivalence.
That makes sense to me. Well, thank you. You handled that question very well. I don't have any further questions. Is there anything else that you would like to say before we wind up?
Ashley, do you want anything you'd like to share first?
Sure. I mean, Dan spoke so eloquently about our educational programming. The one thing that I want to add is I think part of what makes our educational programming so powerful is that a large component is that it is peer-led and that it is peer modeling the behaviors that not in all of our programs, but in some of our programs, it is peers modeling the behaviors they want to see in their school. And I think if you're a student and you're in a marginalized space and you see a welcoming space for you being modeled by your peers, that is extremely powerful. And I just wanted to quickly add that in our reporting system, there's an opportunity to say this happened in a school. And Dan spoke about, those great birth of programming that we have had in Ventura County. And often when things are reported to us that happens in a school, that gives us the opportunity to reach out to, sometimes that's the first time people have heard of ADL and the work we do is when we reach out and say, we learned that this thing happened. If you are interested, we have these resources that we can provide you. So it's just another reason, and I should have included this in when I spoke about all the reasons that reporting is so important. I just wanted to add that's another reason that reporting is so important.
Okay.
And the only thing I think I would add and leave folks with is that we talk about, at ADL, we talk about a pyramid of hate. And that the base level of the pyramid are, these biased attitudes that we all have about something. We all have certain biases. But if those biased attitudes go unchecked, then we start to act on those biases. And if that goes unchecked, eventually we get to acting in violence. It becomes systemic. And so the important thing is to stay at that base end of the pyramid and really try to address biased attitudes where we encounter them. And there's a lot of hesitancy to do so for understandable reasons. But, when we think about civil discourse, and I truly appreciate that question was focused on civil discourse, because when we think about what can we all do kind of in our immediate environment, I think it is about modeling civil discourse. And that means engaging with people with curiosity, finding and reaching out to people that are other than us, looking for openings to have conversations where there's disagreement as opposed to shying away from disagreement, but entering those conversations in a non-judgmental way, that you aren't shutting down. Your purpose is not to shut down the other person's opinion. The purpose is to understand the other person's opinion and to seek opportunities to have conversations about these core values that underlie them. And so one thing that one of the easiest things that I've mentioned is that if you ask somebody about their opinions, you're going to get their conclusions and they're going to defend them. But if instead you ask somebody how they feel about something, what are their feelings on a particular issue or incident, then you often get the fears and anxieties that they have that underlie their conclusions. And it can be a much richer conversation because you may share some of those fears, but you may react to them differently. And a lot of bigotry, a lot of hatred stems from anxiety and fear, and these other really kind of base emotions. And so the question is, how do we get the person that has the bigotry, the biased attitudes back to a place of openness and empathy? And there is a great book out there called Rising Out of Hatred that I loved that is about a white supremacist's transition. And he was really in a prominent white supremacist position, but through 4 years of a college experience in Florida, where he engages with people that he really cares about, that he can't square with these ideological beliefs. You see him undergo this transformation, and you see the elements of those that engaged him, that helped him through that transition. And so I couldn't do this job if I weren't optimistic and hopeful. And so seeing these instances of transformations from hatred, away from hatred, take place is inspiring to me, and really, leads me to try to find these opportunities on a smaller scale to engage when I can, when I encounter bias and bigotry.
Right.
Dan, it's so funny that you mentioned that book, because I almost did the same thing, because I would suggest that book for anyone who they're like, I just can't watch the news. I just don't want to open the paper. I can't open my phone. What is happening in the world? That is the moment that you should pick up. Even though parts of that book are really challenging to read, that is the moment that you should pick up that book, and it'll give you hope.
And that was called Rising Out of Hatred, and it's by
Eli Saslow, I think, is the name of the author.
Okay, thank you.
And then I also just wanted to note that while Dan was speaking, I put a link in the chat, which is kind of ADL's guide to how to have some of these. It's certainly not, no one thing can be all encompassing for everything, but it addresses some of the talking points that Dan was mentioning about how to enter what might be a difficult conversation.
I appreciate that. I see that there, and we will put that on our website. I also wanted to mention that the gentleman who asked a question about a panel discussion responded, again, there is no opposite side of a Holocaust presentation, but a discussant who compares and contrasts with other genocides, such as Rwanda, Native Americans, and Armenia, could get listeners thinking about the situation more. So I think that was a good follow-up to the question
Agreed.
and the answer. So thank you for that, Paul. Dan and Ashley, on behalf of the League and on behalf of all of us present today, we really appreciate you giving us your time today and presenting this very important and impactful information to us. Thank you so much for being here and for all the work that you do. I'm glad that you're optimistic, because I think you need it. And I hope that everybody can get a little bit of the benefit of your information and your optimism, and also get rid of their fears and biases by thinking and learning from people like you. So thank you so much. We have all learned a lot. To the rest of our attendees, please, thank you for attending today. Please let your friends know that the recordings will be available on our website within 48 hours. If you have any suggestions for future Lunch with the League topics, please put them in the chat or contact myself or Betsy Patterson or Pat Butler, and we will take it under advisement. Thank you very much for being here today, and this concludes our session. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.